really today is about this process of thinking about data differently. So this today is really just about how do we think about data. That's my sort of goal for today is to get to a space where we're thinking about data and using data to tell your story. We're going to describe the data context and a little bit about the engagement framework, and then of course next steps in your data journey. So as we go through today, I know there are specific requirements that can come up for you for collecting data. You may have other things that you're interested in talking about. So try to keep that in mind as we go through today's presentation. I came from a school social work background. I spent almost 20 years as a school social worker. So some of my examples will come from that arena. Just know that it's not all applicable to schools, and whatever works for you that I hope you can take away, or how we can put it in that context. But I also know that that's just my life for the last 20 something years has been that. So generally anything I think about comes in that realm. So again, as you think about an issue for you today, collecting data for the grant, those kinds of things, sort of trying to think about that in context. And most importantly, to me, all of this is about how do we use data to tell a story? And really more importantly, how to tell our story or your story with that data. Somebody is going to tell a story about what's happening with your services or with the grant or with your agency. And I would love it to be the people who are doing the work to be able to tell that story, not someone else telling that story for us. So I know there's a lot, and data can be really scary, but it doesn't have to be. It can be really about how do we just think about it in a storytelling sense of using that to get out the great work that we're doing, the impact we're having, and it may even be challenges that we find, and how do we resolve those. So hopefully after today, it'll put you in a space where at least some of that will start to make sense in a broader picture of how data can be useful for us. Too often we talk about things like evidence-based practice and all of those things, and journals and statistical significance. And while I think those are important as a researcher, I also, as a practitioner, and I also understand the real question is, are we making an impact, and how do we let people know about that? And so that's what I want to talk about today, is putting that into a context of where you're at with your stuff and what you might need to be able to do that. So I'll just talk a little bit about my own journey, so it'll give you a sense of where I came from. So I was a school social worker, like I said, for almost 20 years. When I left the school social work profession and to go into higher education, we were at this sort of space beginning of response to intervention, which is just basically data-informed decision making in schools. I spent 3 years doing research at USF, and then I moved into higher ed assessment areas, worked with professors about engaging data. We had all of this data. We would give data, we sort of hand out data, and we'd end up in, lo and behold, we wouldn't use it. And, it sort of perplexed me a little bit about what are we doing wrong, particularly like in classes. We would say, okay, here's your end of course feedback. Here's what students said. And the next semester we'd get the same feedback from students on professors. And it was like, well, we gave you the data. Why are you not using it? So it really started my own journey on how do we support thinking about data so it's useful. In higher ed, in K-12, it's often not an issue of not having data, right? It's called data rich, information poor. We have a lot of data. It's just making decisions based on that data wasn't a standard practice. And so when I left the school district, I did, like I said, higher ed administration. I got back into being a professor. I called all my friends in the school district, and lo and behold, we were in the same space we were like 10 years earlier. Like nothing had changed in the conversation we're having around data. And it started to think for me, sort of, how do we think about this more broadly, right? That this is not just an issue of social work, it's an issue of nonprofit work. It's an issue of what I would say is like seeing it in healthcare, right? It's a universal issue in terms of how do we take data and make sense of that so it can be used for us to make decisions. And so that's what I want to talk about a lot today, is really that context of, one, that journey, but also how that might help you inform the work that you're doing to think about it differently. So I'll stop periodically as well to sort of leave a space for questions. But I also want to share this difference between that. I think sometimes when we think about data use, and so being higher ed, I'm very guilty of this. We think of this as being really data driven, that if we don't have tests and we don't have pre-post and we don't have, that's the only value in data. And I think there's a space where our own tuition and judgment, our review of the data also comes in handy. So I'd like to think about more practitioner-based, data-informed rather than data-driven. That's how I like to look at things personally. It's the work that you're doing on the ground and how things happen is really important. And I'll just share a little story about that. I was working before I got into when I was in the school district, I was in maternal and child health. So I ran a teen parenting program, and so that was my life. I got into higher ed, so I still knew when I was going to school, I knew people who were in that realm, and I was reading all these new great articles. And then there was something on centering parenting. I don't know if anyone has used that as a prenatal care approach. So if you have, great. If not, I'll share it with you. It's this idea of group prenatal care. And it was sort of just coming out in the research market. And I had some friends in maternal and child health. And I talked to them and I said, hey, let me tell you about this great article I read. It's fantastic, right? It's this new wave of what we're looking at, a new way to do prenatal care, particularly with undocumented families. And so the one person I was sharing it with turned to me, and does anyone want to guess what her response was to the article? So this is just like teaching, right? So do I have to call on somebody? Just throw out something. What do you think she said? Like, wow, now I've learned something and I can change, how we do prenatal care. So absolutely not. Her comment to me was, no crap, we've been doing this for 20 years and you're just now getting around to researching it, right? So I also want to put some value in the work that you're already doing and you're seeing. And the question becomes is how can we use that to drive data-informed decisions around what you're already doing that's effective and learn how to collect data on that. So again, we can tell your story about your effectiveness. I think that was a wake-up call for me, though, that sometimes that just because something isn't in a research article, we don't want to ignore the people who are in the field and seeing these things happen. And so I also want to think about data in that context as well. And so I love this picture. If you've ever been to the Redwood Forest and you look up and you sort of see this, you look up and you can't see the sky, and it seems overwhelming and just like you don't know where to start. And I look at this guy standing here with a saw, and eventually he'll get through that tree. I mean, it might be his whole life's work, but he'll get through the tree. And I sort of think of this as the way that we look at data, right? There's a lot of data coming at us from all over the place. It's hard to figure out where to start, what to look at. And if all we have is a saw, everything we'll look at is going to be in that context. And so it's really thinking about data differently in terms of what are the tools that we need to think about data and look at data sort of in a different way. And so that's what I would also encourage you to do today is to sort of think about that and how those tools that we have can be used differently, or do we need a different set of tools to think about the questions we're asking? And so that's ultimately all of the kinds of things that I'd like to look at today is this the right tool for the story I want to tell? Do we need another tool? And how do we get that if we need it? So again, when I left the school district, this was sort of state-of-the-art data. We had a little sheet we would fill out, and we would just collect data on the services we provided. And then we'd collect them at the end of the year and we write up a report that says we provided this many services. And it was a fantastic piece of data for the story we were trying to tell at that time, which is just essentially the work that we did. My supervisor at the time asked me, can we show that school social work services are effective? And, and I said, well, probably not with the data we're collecting. She said, but we've been collecting data for 10 years. And the answer is it wasn't the data to tell the story we wanted to tell. And so it really took a lot of time to think about those kinds of things in how do we get the data that tells the story for us. That sometimes data in and of itself is great, sometimes it's not so great if it's not really telling that story. So again, I would like you to think about up front the kinds of stories you want to tell with data. What do you want to show? What do you want to talk about? And so I do have to put a context here that I love data. And so when I talk about data, I'm coming from a perspective that I absolutely love data. I love teaching about data. I love talking about data, and particularly systematically collected data. And so I also know that from the perspective I come from, that not everybody comes from that perspective. I sometimes find that hard to believe. Like when I teach research classes, I have to think that, I have to say up front or get this conversation with students that when your eyes roll back in your head, it's not out of excitement apparently over the data we're talking about. That it's apparently not that they're so excited that they, their eyes roll back. So I get that. So I want to sort of talk about that as well as we go along. So I'll stop here before I go. And if there's any questions you want to put in the chat or anything like that, I'll just sort of leave it as a brief space if there's any quick questions anybody has before we jump into a little bit more about the data informed pieces of this. Perfect. So we're going to talk a little bit about data engagement, and I'd also encourage you to think about where you are at data engagement and levels of data sophistication. And it really starts with the kinds of questions we ask about the data we're collecting. And so sort of at the first level, we get to a space where we'd say, I have this data and I want to show this outcome, right? I've been collecting data for 10 years. I want to show that school social workers are effective in their work. But we've only been collecting data on the number of services we've provided. And so oftentimes there's a huge misalignment between this, but I've been collecting the data and I want to show this outcome, sort of this first level of thinking about data. And we get to this space of, well, we've been collecting it. Why can't we show that? And so think about where you are in your data journey as well. And the second step is sort of, I have this data. What can I do with it? So it's now the next level of, I've been collecting data for a little while. I want to look at the data. What questions could it answer for me? Right. And so as we move up this sort of level of thinking about data differently, we start to move into a space with, I've got data. I'm not trying to answer a specific question. It's more like, what can I answer with this? And then we move up to a space where we're starting to think about, what data do I actually need to answer this question? So if I want to say we are effective in these services, what data do I need to show that? And effective may be very different for you than for somebody else. It may be, how satisfied are people with our services? Right. And so if that's the question, that's a different set of data, right? How efficient are our services is a different set of data, right? What is the impact we've had? So it's really starting with your question and say, I would like to know this. What do I need to do to answer that question? And so again, starting to think more about how data fits in with the questions and the story we're trying to tell, and having us drive that story rather than the data drive that story. Right, to say, we've been collecting this is all I can do, more so being proactive in that process. And then we get to a space that says, hey, I'm working for someone else. I want to support their work. What kinds of data would they need to support their work? So I know that my agency is really focused on engaging parents in their children's services. What data would we need for that? So we're thinking more broadly about, how do we support a system with data? And then finally, I would say, what does a comprehensive data engagement system like? I think this is more like sort of self-actualization, right? We sort of never reach that, but we're really trying to reach that goal to say, if we comprehensively thought about data and engaging with data, what might a system like that look like? And so again, for yourself, thinking about where you are, what I have found, and I do consultations across the country, is that most of us start in this area of, I have data, what can I do with it? I have this data and I want to show an outcome. If we can get to a space where it's like, what data do I need to answer this question? I think we'd really be able to tell our story rather than someone else telling the story for us. And that would help us drive the kinds of services that we're interested in providing, right? Because I also recognize that I suspect most people don't get into providing services because they're interested in data, right? They don't say, like, I'd love to do data around the services. I want to show that I'm effective. I really want to impact families. And that's why you get into this. Students, families, youth. And so when that happens, it's how do we then show what we're doing is effective? So I also recognize that there has to be some data investment. So as you think about your own space and your data and when you're collecting data, it's do you have structural supports? Do you have the tools to collect data? It's very difficult to collect data if you don't have the right tools. I don't know if anyone's tried to, so when I was going through graduate school, they used SPSS. I don't know if anyone's used SPSS, but if you try to get a copy of that outside of a university, it can be anywhere between 12 and I think $20,000. I think for a copy of SPSS, if you want the full, right, it's almost impossible to use. And so if we're trained on one thing and we don't have the tools to collect it or analyze it later, what good is that going to do? And so I also think that that's really important to think about up front. Do we have the tools to do what we want to do with the data? Does that limit us, right? Do we need a place to do Survey Monkey? Do we need someone to analyze the data later and those kinds of things? Do we have a group of people who help us with that? Oftentimes, when we get into, and again, I'll speak from my school social work experience, is that every person, every different individual school social worker had to be an expert in data collection, data analysis, interventions, and it's hard to keep up with that. And so how do we utilize other people who might be part of that team and say, hey, my expertise is really great at putting things in a spreadsheet. But if you want somebody to talk about it later, that's not my area, right? Or if you want someone to do the analysis, I can't do that, but I'm great at collecting and making lists. So I'm a list person. If you ever need a list, call me, right? That's my thing. I love to have lists. And now if I use them, again, that would be a even better function, but I can pass them along to people who can use them, right? So I'm really good at creating lists. And so I have to work with a team who is good at doing things with those lists. We also want to be in a community that really supports looking at data, that says it's okay to have the wrong data, to not make an impact, and say, well, what's going on so we can make an impact, right? It's really important to be at a space where it's okay to take risks around data and what we call a culture of inquiry, right? To say, we're just exploring this and we don't have to be right with it. We're just trying. And if it works, great. And if not, we're going to look at why it didn't work rather than getting in trouble for it not working, right? To say, if it's not working, let's have a conversation of what's going on. Are we using the right measures? Have we advertised in the right place? Is this the right intervention for the people we're working with? So really thinking about that. And then getting to a space where it's okay to say, this is not going to be a quick fix, that everybody's going to be engaged, and we're really purposeful about the data we collect, how we collect it, when we collect it, that it's not an afterthought, that it's really thought through this whole process that's driven by the question of what do we want to do, what do we want to show, and then working backwards from there. And so really taking that time to speak and be in that space. And so if we don't have those data investments, sometimes it doesn't really matter what we do, that if we don't have the right tools to collect the data, it's going to be very difficult for us. So again, thinking about some of that stuff up front. And finally, here's something that if you're interested later on, I can send you the link to this, just sort of a way to look at your organization and to say, are we ready and are we data focused? So, things like, do we maintain a clear focus? Do we have short and long-term goals, right? Do we embrace the spirit of inquiry? Do we put data at the center? Do we learn about data? Do we continually learn? Do we set meaningful goals? Do we seek equity? Is everybody involved in this? This idea of our community being engaged in it, right? So really just thinking about, now that you've got data, are you really ready to do that? And so again, there's a citation here, and so we can send that out later if you're interested in looking at this later to say, where are we at as an organization, and where do we need to be? So just another way to sort of start to think about data for yourself. So, and then finally, again, I'm just going to take a second based on what we've sort of started to talk about before we move into the next phase. And if you want to put it in the chat, that would be great. If you just want to think about it, that's also fantastic. So I'll give you just a minute to think about what level of data engagement has your organization currently? What do you have or need to do that or take it to the next level? And how would you rate your level of data readiness? So I'll just stop for a second just to give you a minute to reflect and think about it as we're going through the rest of sort of today, but just as a starting point. Okay, perfect. So it looks like everyone is thinking about that. So I appreciate that. So we're going to talk a little bit about this data engagement framework. And again, it comes from this work that I've done both in K-12 with some nonprofit work with higher ed, really thinking about beyond these ideas of structural supports, what does it really take to utilize data to make informed decisions? And so how do we become data informed and what that process might look like? And so we're going to cover sort of each of these that it's come that if you don't address each of these, it becomes difficult to do data engagement. So you have to have the right data, you have to have access to the data, you have to be able to make sense of the data, identify causes, make changes, and track that impact. And so we'll talk a bit about each of these, but we're going to walk through this. But it's really a process for thinking about how do I become data informed, even though we're collecting a lot of data. If any of these phases is not fully attended to, we sort of get stuck and it's hard to move on to the next stage. So we'll look at each of these individually. So the first part is right data. I mean, if you don't have the right data, if you haven't collected the right data that answers the question you're asking, nothing else matters. And also understanding that each question you ask may require you to think about a different focus or source or support, a different source of data. So if I'm interested in saying how, like, I want to increase the number of people who are employed in my agency, right? It just might be how busy are we? That's important. If I'm interested in how satisfied people are with the services at the agency, that's a completely different data set that we would need to collect, or a different focus of data that we would need to sort of hit on. And so the three areas that we'll talk about today, and we'll spend a bit about time thinking about that, would be focus, source, and support framework. So first off would be focus, meaning, right, obviously it must answer the question being asked. And so, here are two types, right? Like, so maybe some outcome data is an example. If I'm interested in outcomes, my data should support outcomes, right? And so this is something that we often see in schools, right? Is, students at risk because their credits, they're missing school, something like that, right? They're not showing up for services, however we decide to look at that, right? But really the outcome is the focus of our data. And so if you're interested in that, then your data should really speak to outcomes, which is great if you're looking at the overall impact of your services. The challenge is, if you're interested in why those outcomes are the way they are, right, then perhaps you might want to look at data that looks like the underlying factors that are causing that, right? So as an example, we might be interested in the outcomes of GPA, but we know that teacher relationships, students doing their homework, right, educational support all impact that. And so if we want to intervene in terms of the outcome, like why it's happening, we have to have data that speaks to that. And so again, thinking about that whole spectrum of data that says, what really is my question, right? Is it the impact? Is it why is this impact happening? Is it why are my families struggling with services? All of those would require us to think about that sort of differently, right? And sort of what are the causes for those outcomes that we need to think about those relationships. And so just thinking about your question, making sure that the data you collect really speaks to what questions you're asking and what is the focus of that. We'll often ask about the source of the data as well. So like, where does this data come from? And so that's also extremely important, right? Like, so there are sort of three major places where we can get data. So one, of course, is journal articles. And so, right, can come from the literature, research only. We read a study. This says it's popular. This says this is the standard measure. This is what we're going to use. So that's one space data can come from. The other space, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, is really practice-based evidence. I've been doing this work. I've really been seeing an impact with it. I want to figure out, I want to show that this is effective. And so the right data might be, I'm doing this practice. What do I need to show that that's effective? Because in my experience, this has been making a difference, right? I don't see it in the literature anywhere. On the other token, I don't know if anyone's tried to access literature if you're not in school. Again, nearly impossible. And so how do you support that? But if you're doing great things, the question would be, how do you then show that that's being effective, right? So that would be sort of practice-based evidence. And then finally, we talk about what we call like a theory of change, or this theory, just, I think this is what's happening. Let me look at collecting data around that, right? And so one of the things that I worked with teen moms, and I've always had this theory that part of the reason they had challenges with raising their children is there was a feeling sometimes that their children were trying to do things on purpose, right? That's, again, the ones I worked with be like, well, they're crying and they're trying to upset me. And I'm like, your child's like 6 months old. They're really not, right? So it's really thinking then about, my theory is maybe it's around knowledge of development for their children. And if we can look at that, maybe that will change parenting practices, right? So again, I could have done that. I left the school before I was able to do that, but maybe I do it and I find out that's not it. Let's go another route. But that would be one theory that I had, that I think that this is what's happening with the teen moms that I'm working with. Let me test that out to see if that's really going on, right? I'm not doing an intervention yet, so it's not quite practice-based evidence. And at the same token, there are no journal articles on it. So this is really, I have a theory. Now I want to sort of figure out, is that theory really happening? And so that's another way that we can look at data in terms of the right data. So which of those fit for what you're doing when you're thinking about your outcomes, right, and your goals? And finally, it should support your framework. And so what I mean for this is, if you're interested in positive youth development, you should have measures of positive youth development, right? It doesn't do you any good to not have those if you're interested in that. If you're interested in risk and protective factors, then you should be measuring and looking at risk and protective factors. So really thinking about, does the data collect from the framework from which I'm thinking about this issue? So again, if I'm working with parents and teen moms, I should have some stuff that measures their perspective on things, given this is where I'm coming from. So does it support your framework? And so as an example, this is just, again, the rest of the regression you don't need to look at. But if I'm interested in risk factors, then I need to have a list of risk factors, right? And so each of these is a risk and protective factor impacting youth development. If I'm more interested in a group, like I'm working with Latino males, and I'm interested in Latino male fathers as an example, well, then I should be collecting data around Latino male fathers, right? So again, it should come from the framework from which I'm thinking. So if I had just and I wasn't able to break it down by the groups I'm interested in, it would be difficult later to then look back and say, well, I want to know how the group I'm working with or I'm interested in is changing or impacted by this. So again, doing some thinking up front around, what is the data that I need to answer my question? And again, looking at things like focus, looking at that. So again, for yourself, just thinking about this, what is the right data for you, for your question? What's working well? What are your challenges? And do you have any success stories? So just start to think about that as questions to consider around the data you're collecting and the data that you have. So I did a study where we looked at school social workers and we said, how confident are you that you have the right data? Just so you guys know, what we ended up with was about a third thought they were highly confident that the right data. So typically this is what we find is when we look at organizations and nonprofit, about a third think they have the right data to make the decisions that they want to make, looking at low, middle, high. So again, I'll pause here for a second if anyone has any questions or comments. And that includes Brooke, Evan, Chase, Darrell, if you have anything you'd like to add. On the right track? Perfect. So then after you have the data, you've got the right data, you have to have access to the data. I know that seems pretty simple, but when we think about data, if it's difficult to get to, you've collected it, it sits in a system where you need 27 passwords that keep changing, you can't find it later. Maybe you're using Google and Excel sheets, but can you get your hands off the data that you've already collected? Right? That is the most important thing. If you don't do that, then again, doesn't really matter. You can collect all the data in the world. If you can't access it later, or if it's on pieces of paper that someone has to then look at separately later, and I think you find it. I think we had one of these cases where we found it like 5 years later in someone's desk drawer. We're like, oh, here's where all the surveys went that we collected, right? Didn't matter what we collected. If we couldn't use them or we couldn't find them, it really did us no good. So starting to think about, right, do I have access to the data that I need, right? So is it readily accessible? Otherwise, we'll just go back to using what we've been using before, rather than trying to be more systematic about this. And it should also be quick and easy to find. So as you think about your data systems, whether it's Google Sheets, Excel, right, something that everybody can access from somewhere to get the data, to put the data in, to make those decisions. So if you don't have that, again, it's going to be almost impossible to use the data. So again, are you using a Google or an Excel sheet, that everybody can have their hands on? It's a shared document. Does one person have it and they're off on Mondays, the day that you need to have it? Is someone handing it out later and sending an email? Those kinds of things. Again, starting to think about up front, we've collected the data, we've got the right data. How are we going to collect it in a way that is really useful for us to get to later on? So I know this is this is what we'll call latent class analysis. And I know it looks a little scary because it is, but I've actually had a researcher send this exact data to somebody to say, here's your data on the stuff you've been collecting, right? And so to me, this is not access to data if I see it in this form, right? So it should be in a way that you can access it, and it's also not lost in space somewhere, right, where no one has access to it. So does it go into a black hole, or can we collect it? So as you think about setting up your systems of data collection, it should be in the first place is, do I have the right data? What is that? How am I going to collect it? Where am I going to put it? And what does that look like? And so it might be in charts, right? It might be in right? So charts and tables, all of those kinds of things might be a space where you put it so that you can access it later and see it in a way that's useful for you. So you might also use a dashboard. I love dashboards. So dashboards are a nice place to do that. And again, a way that's really quick, easy identification as a place to go. So this would be another way to look at access to the data. So, does everybody have access? Does somebody just need to see the table or the chart, right? And so do we all put it in a dashboard so we can sit around on Monday or Friday and talk about how the week went and what kinds of changes are we having? So it's easy, it's accessible, and allow you to quickly identify areas of concern or areas that are going great. But I don't want to ignore that either, that oftentimes we think about data as showing what's not working well, but there are plenty of cases where we can use data that's working well. And perhaps one of your areas is you want to engage parents in mentoring. And so I worked with a school district where they looked at youth who were doing really well and had a lot of protective factors. And those were identified immediately as people who could be mentors to students because they had all of these things going that we were looking for. So data can be used for lots of different purposes. Again, just really depends on the question you're asking. So it just should be in a format that's just easy to read, easy to interpret, and again, quickly accessible in a manner that makes sense for you. Okay, so again, similar questions to consider when you think about your data, and you might not be at that space yet where you're looking at that specific data, but these are questions you're going to want to consider moving forward. Do you have access to the data you need? Is it usable, right? What working well? What supports do you have? What supports do you need? What's successful? Again, just consider these things as you go through your data process and building your data systems, and again, thinking about data to tell your story, right? If we don't have the data, if we can't get the data, someone else will do that, or they're just going to make up something that has nothing to do with the services we're providing. And that story that's told isn't the story about how impactful we are, which is the reason we're here. So, and again, I'd say, how confident are you that you have access to your data? Same group of people, about a third, right? So about a third said, I'm highly confident I have the right data, highly confident I could get to it if I needed to. Finally, once you have access, you have to know what to do with it. I think this more is the analysis phase, right? Like making meaning of that data. So when I see it, I have to know what to do with it. We can't just assume because there's data that decisions you'll make or somebody would make are going to be based on that data. I go back to my example with end of course evaluations and teachers. We would provide all of this data and feedback that said, here's the areas your students have mentioned that you're struggling. We just assumed that when we said they'd like more readings, that you would have brought more readings in, right? And so perhaps when they were reading through the end of course evaluations, they were looking at something different, interpreting it through their lens. But it's also important to understand how to look at that data in a way that's meaningful for you, whether it's, and I think we'll talk about this in a minute, but whether it's descriptive, whether it's diagnostic, whether it's predictive, or prescriptive, right? And again, stuff you don't need to know today, but just something to think about to say, hey, I do really good at this, but I'd love to have more information on how do we analyze data later on, right? And that's something then you would want to look at exploring a little further. So again, do you get data like this sometimes? Probably not. I do. When I see this, I get all excited, right? So probably not everyone else is probably falling asleep or throwing up now or something like that. But so if you got this data, probably not very meaningful for you, right? So for me, it might be, but for someone else, it's not going to be. Similarly, if you get data like this, probably not very meaningful for you. For me, extremely. So depending on where you are in your data journey, you're going to say, I would like data to look like this, or I need to work through it like this. So maybe it's simply looking at correlations, right? What kinds of relationships are we looking at? And you'd say, I'm interested in the relationship between these two things. I'm going to learn about how to do simple relationships so I can look at that, right? But it's learning that maybe I'm more interested in pre-post, saying, did this group do better when they got in than when they left? I've tried these two different trainings and I want to know which one worked better for my families, right? So again, it's not about learning everything. It's about saying, with my question, here's the data that I need, here's how I'm going to access it, and this is what I'm going to do to make meaning of it, because this really answers that question. And so starting to think about those kinds of things is really, really important. If I have a gold standard and I want to say, well, the national standard for depression is this, I'm doing a depression intervention. Am I doing better than the national standard? Again, I just need one simple test to do that. And it's trying to figure that out to say, based on the data, how do I know what to do with that data? And then how can we learn if I need that support to reach out and get that kind of help? It may be something as simple as qualitative data. Maybe your intake forms have information that you're collecting. And so in this case, it's a school psychosocial. But I'd like you to think about it more broadly than the individual psychosocial, but how do you analyze all your intake forms across all of them that you collect and say, are we noticing any trends in why people are coming in for services? If we're looking at services, right, what really worked with our clients across all clients, right? And so really thinking about how do we gather that data in a way that's meaningful for us to make choices and decisions for our agency, for our goals and our questions. And so again, it's about just as much as what's working, what's not, right? It's important to know how to interpret. And so, if you feel like this is an area that you would need additional work in, I would encourage you to do that. Because if we don't have this skill set in answering those questions, oftentimes we'll go to something else that we know that may not be the best, the most useful for what we're trying to do. So again, just trying to think about your question, the data you have, how you're going to collect it, what you're going to do with it once you get it. So maybe it is simply just doing a graph and saying that's what we need to answer this question. Are we seeing changes over time? It doesn't have to be super complicated. Again, I really get excited when we start talking about t-tests and those things, but it might just be that, hey, we just need to track trends over time, and that's going to really show us the kinds of things we're looking for. And that's great. if that answers your question. And that's the ultimate goal of all of this, right? To answer your question, to tell your story. So, do you know how to review, analyze, and make meaning of your data? And similarly, how confident are you? And anybody want to take a guess on what percentage said they were highly confident that they could make sense of their data? If you guessed a third, you'd be right on, right? So we're right about the same, right? About a third said they have the right data, they can access this data, right? So we're seeing sort of similar trends here, that which was very interesting. I found a little interesting that it goes up a little bit in the mid, that they don't have the right data. But we'll talk about that one in the next one. So, and then finally, you have to identify causes. So there'll be a couple more phases here. Like, what's the cause and effect of our outcomes with our impact, right? So when we see this data, we also want to start to think about, what is that data trying to tell us, right? So it's really just trying to think about the root causes of, if I'm seeing a no change in pre-post, what's going on? If I'm seeing a trend in increasing clients from a certain issue that we hadn't seen before, right? We might want to say, what are the causes that are going to help us make that intervention, right? So we're really just sort of guessing at this phase, right? Really, though, saying, what is the data trying to tell us based on the data that we have, right? If our students aren't improving, what's going on? If we're seeing an increase in suspensions in schools, what's going on that's causing that suspension, right? So that we can start to consider all possible influences before jumping to conclusions, but start to think about where we might intervene based on what the data is telling us. And this might also lead you to a space where I need more data, right? If I only had data on this, I could answer this question. And so starting to think about, right? So as an example, and again, I'll go back into school because that's my world that I live in. If I'm working and I have students who are missing school for attendance issues, right? We have an increase in attendance, and we have truancy. In and of itself, right? I have to have a theory of why they're truant before I can intervene, right? So if students are missing school because they're feeling unsafe coming through their community, well, that's going to be a different intervention than if I'm working in an area where I have a lot of undocumented youth who have to stay home to take care of their little brother or sister while their parents work, right? So the intervention will be completely different, but I have to start to think about, what is the data telling me based on the context that I know before I could make an intervention. And so it's really then starting to think about, once I have the data, once I've analyzed it, what do I think is going on with the data? What is causing these trends? What is causing sort of the things that I'm seeing in the data? And so that I can start to look at some interventions to do that align with the questions that we've asked, with the data we have. So simply knowing the analysis will never be enough. And so it's really now starting to use, when we talked about earlier, this idea of practice driven or data informed decision making. It's now your intuition. What do I think is going on? What do I see? What else do I know? That the data is speaking the context of that. And so really start to think about that, right? This sort of, what works here might not work there, right? So really thinking about the when, where, how, and why of things. This is a school issue. So again, I'm going to use a school example. If we're seeing students not being successful, we would want to look at things like, is it the students' knowledge that's the problem? Is there a culture or a community that isn't supportive of our students? Do our personnel not have the skills to engage? Do they not know how to engage students? Right? Are they not learning because the materials we're using aren't the right materials? Right? Is the curriculum not designed the right way to scaffold? Right? All of these things we would just want to consider in this phase to say, what do we think is going on in this space? Right? So identify causes and interpret sort of is our next phase. So, and again, when we say this, we'd say identify causes and interpret. I asked, like, what percentage, and interestingly enough, 50% said they could identify causes and interpret, which was interesting to me, that if they don't have the right data, they don't have access to the data, they don't know how to do anything with data, they know why things are happening. So again, just an interesting piece of that. But this really is about thinking about, can we identify causes and potential solutions? Then, of course, the next step is to make changes. You have to do something, right? At that point, it's not enough just to sort of think about it. When I worked in the school district, I think teachers, has anyone worked in a school district before? So I don't know if you have or you haven't, but teachers would always say, I'm going to wait till next year because what they're asking me to learn will change. And so I don't need to learn it this year. And so, right, it's really, you'd think that, okay, I have the data. I told you what to do. I think I know what's going on. I know what to do, that I'd be able to make those changes. And magically, sometimes they don't happen. So it's really, you have to do something and help people, support them in taking that action. So if you say, we need to do this, then the question would be, what resources do we need to make that decision, right? And so we know that in some cases, different groups respond differently. We might want to match a specific intervention to specific groups that we're working with. We might want to partner with a university or other nonprofits. But either way, it's really thinking about, what do I want to do? How do I get that done? And what support do I need to make that happen? So really, again, just thinking about that in the way that how do we move forward with making those changes happen? So again, how do you use data to drive that? That's what I would ask you to think about. And then finally, going back to this, 50% said they had the ability to intervene. So just wanted to share that as just sort of that study. And then finally, what we call closing the loop. Did it make a difference? Did the work we're doing actually have the intended impact that we want to have? And so to start to consider those, looking at the data and more in a sense of looking at the story we're trying to tell. Where are we at with that story? And do we need to look at other aspects of that? And oftentimes this will bring you back to another space. If you're successful, fantastic. If you're like, we did good in this area, but we could really still grow in this area, it's starting then to think about those things and look at those things as well and say, what else do we need to do? Are there other interventions? Is there other data? Are there changes we need to make? So really starting this whole process over at that point as a loop that just sort of would continue on, and really thinking about, how do we intervene? How do we do impact? Are we looking at outcomes, impact, process? All of those things sort of start to come into play when we're tracking that impact. It might be outcomes, it might be process. Did we improve our processes? All of those things come into play. How do you track your implementation of your interventions? Sort of thinking about that in terms of effectiveness. And finally, rating yourself. We're back to about 30%. Most or a third didn't track themselves, so that they stopped there. So my final thoughts are really thinking about this data engagement framework and where do you want to be, where are you currently, what are your next steps, and what additional support. So I'm going to leave it open for questions from anybody who's here. Chase, Brooke, Darrell, Evan, is there anything else that you'd like me to expand upon or have questions about that I could share around this idea of how do we think about data to tell our story rather than having someone else tell that story for us?
I would just add, Robert, to everyone, we will be having a session on service documentation. And I think it's really important for you to think about, there are things that you are documenting because it's what your funder needs to know, right? In order for them to tell their story about what's happening in the state. I want to encourage you not to let their story be yours, be the only one that you tell. That you think too about, in addition to what you're required to report to your funder, what in addition to that do you want to know? Right? And in order to fully understand the impact that your program is having, and the ways in which you're achieving the goals you set, and maybe achieving some goals you didn't set, having some impact you didn't anticipate. And so I really, really encourage you. I want to thank Dr. Lucio so much for this really, talking about data can be just so difficult, right? And I think I want to congratulate Dr. Lucio for making it so palatable. It's something that I think we can all relate to. And so now as we start thinking about what we're documenting and how we're documenting that, in addition to sort of what's required, and we'll be talking about that in a follow-up session on service documentation, but also think about, what story do you want to tell? And what data do you need to collect in order to be able to tell that story? Thank you so much. And I don't know if anyone else has something you'd like to add.
I was just going to pose a quick question to the group because one of my favorite things about this job is really just getting to hear about what you all are doing in your organization. So I'm wondering if this has prompted for anyone to think about you're seeing a specific issue that you really want to start tracking and asking more questions about. Maybe it might be a population that you're serving or a specific issue that you see some of your clients dealing with that you all want to gather more information to inform your services. So if anyone has anything to put in the chat, we'd love to hear about it.
And Darrell, I almost answered your question. You said, when talking about data, and I was going to say fun was the first word that came to mind to me, but probably not for everybody else.
Yeah, it's fun for me too. So I love telling stories with data. I love letting people know what we can do. And just also to let everyone know, we're here to support you in that too. So just know that's one of the things that you can reach out to and say, hey, I'd like to maybe explore this a little bit more. Happy to provide support around.
Absolutely. And we will make sure that this recording is on our website. And Chase or Evan, if you all can link our email address and our phone number and our website one more time, since they might have to scroll all the way through our long chat, just so they have that available. And then I will get that document from Dr. Lucio as well to send out that you talked about, just seeing where your organization is at in terms of your data collection with our follow-up. And then, of course, as always, I'll send out our training evaluation, speaking of data, so that I can gather some more, information on what best meets the needs of all of our organizations. And like Darrell said, please don't hesitate to reach out to us for anything that you all may need, whether it's contracting, as I know you all are really in the thick of it right now, working on that, or whether it be another topic. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Brooke, just real quick, I want to just note that Jana noted something really important. We need to start tracking what life circumstances may affect a client's report of our program impact as they participate in the program. I think just in order to have a full understanding of the challenges, well, I don't want to just say the challenges, of the strengths and the needs of the people with whom you work, doing that sort of comprehensive assessment at the outset is going to be really important, so that you do know sort of what resources they may have, what connections, social connections, and resources personal resources they may have that will support them through this process, but also so that you're very, very fully aware of the kinds of challenges they're facing as well, particularly with respect to the social determinants of health. Those are just really important outcome areas that I think you want to be aware of from the outset when working with people who come to you for assistance in your program. Yes, thank you, Jana, for pointing that out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jana. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions or comments, I'll go ahead and close it up. Thank you all for attending, and I hope everyone has a great week. I'll also send out a weekly update just for some other trainings that we have coming up, and make sure that they're on your all's radar. So have a great afternoon, and we're thankful you came. And thank you.